In this second module on Windshear, I'd like to talk about the approach segment and be more descriptive about some of the conditions and some of the tools that you have available to cope with this situation, and some of the human factor considerations that ought to be evaluated prior to and during an approach where you're dealing with wind shear phenomena. Now, the one thing that I can't provide in a realistic simulation format is the actual effect of wind shear during an approach. In fact, even in sophisticated flight training devices, they have to program these conditions very specifically for certain types of wind shear conditions that can be simulated, and I don't have that kind of sophistication. The thing that's ironic about it is that this obviously is a condition that can occur maybe a few times that you might be flying during the course of a year, so it's not something that is encountered on a regular basis. It's not a routine phenomena that you have to deal with. So it kind of is one of those situations that you get educated on. You're expected to retain some information, know some operating procedures that your airline would have, and some thought processes that are associated with this. But it unfortunately isn't something that you can dynamically practice through simulation. It's kind of the real thing where you get most of your experience in dealing with this. So the bottom line here is you get very little opportunity to practice this in a training environment. Most of the time you're kind of dealing with the real thing and having to recall any kind of training that you did have, and knowing the thought process and the systems that are available to you. So a lot of this is just learned from reading, but what I'm going to do is do a PowerPoint briefing here and present some thought processes and kind of show you at least some tools that you have on the approach, and if and when you have to react, we'll cover that. One of the first things I'd like to cover, if you're having to encounter some of these conditions at a given airport at a given time, is the ATIS information may have some reports of low-level wind shear or wind shear advisories that are in effect. Now, if you know about these situations well ahead of time, this gives you an opportunity to evaluate, prepare for either continuing and making the approach and reviewing as a crew how you're going to operate in this situation, and review some of the tools that are available to you. Now, one of the things that I think is important to consider when it comes to wind shears, even the systems that are available to us now, they give you information on wind shears at low altitudes during the approach. Now, I told you about a few of the encounters I had during my experience on the line, and certainly there are many others, and all of you have probably had some kind of encounters as well. But the point I'm trying to make here, gang, is one of the things you could always consider is if they have these kinds of conditions, depending on the severity, you may want to consider just delaying making the approach, because wind shear conditions are generally transitory. They move through an area and dissipate to some degree, and you can make those approach with maybe some delays if you have the fuel, if you have the circumstances to be able to consider waiting 15-20 minutes until some of these conditions subside. I can tell you that I think a lot of us who maybe encountered this kind of condition, you probably lean toward not challenging it. We have to be considerate of our airline and the operations and how it would affect the operation. But the bottom line is you maybe really might be more prudent to just delay making that approach. If the ATIS information on the arrival indicates Windshear advisories, my suggestion is to consider one of the pilots, and that should probably be the pilot monitoring, take on the additional task to monitor tower frequency for the current aircraft approaches and what they're reporting the conditions are. It's good to have that heads up. In most cases, if you get this information even prior to starting your arrival, it may be in that time period the conditions would change. But I would suggest that what you do is have that one pilot continually monitor on and off. Maybe every few minutes go back and to the tower frequency and listen to what's going on. It's a good way to get a heads up about what conditions actually are, rather than the general information that was given to you on ATIS. An important part of dealing with wind shears is brief yourselves on how to deal with the communication that you'll have with one another and how you're going to monitor information and how you're going to coordinate talking about that information during an approach. Review the terms, the words to be used among you. And here's an area, gang, where I would say that don't get into long, lengthy discussions. If on the approach, for instance, if you start losing altitude during the approach, just mention descending and give the radio altimeter altitude. Don't be in long discussions, but descending, we're 500 feet, descending 300 feet, level 400 feet, level 400 feet, climbing, and so these are the kinds of terms you want to make brief statements here that can be understood by the pilot flying, rather than telling him how to fly the situation or coming out with long dissertations about what's happening. Make them brief, make them so that they can be understood. And by all means, don't try and describe how to fly the aircraft. The pilot flying is dealing with that, and if you just give him some information that he can interpret for a reaction, that's what's important. Review and even discuss, because your Windshear alert system, they may be different at different airlines, different airplanes. Make sure that you review and discuss how that system operates when you're making an approach. Don't automatically assume that your partner knows how the system operates. It's a good idea to brief one another and question and discuss how the system operates. And here is just a reiteration of what I said in the 2 bullet points away. Pilot monitoring, use concise, understandable words, especially if the wind shear is encountered. It's important to let them know what the radio altitude is. Is the aircraft descending? Is it level? Is it climbing? Those are the key terms on the pilot flying to understand what's happening when he's working hard trying to fly the flight director, especially after you execute a wind shear escape maneuver. Now, here's another thing that's important for a tool that you have available to you. On the approach, and I kind of mentioned this in one of the previous sessions that I gave to you, but on the FMC, go to progress page 2 for the winds that are affecting the aircraft at that given moment. So there's one important source, and that ought to be monitored and by the pilot monitoring on the approach, and also the nav display wind vector readouts. And so what's important there is to be looking for any kind of changes in what the wind direction is and what its velocity. And the aircraft is really great at giving you that information. For instance, if you let's say on the approach you have a quartering headwind and it starts to move to a crosswind and the velocities increase, you can expect that it's very likely, maybe even going to turn to a tailwind. And this is where you can anticipate and probably start to seriously consider abandoning the approach. If that wind direction is changing in such a manner of rapidity and direction and velocity, the prudent thing is get out of there. I'm a big advocate of don't mess around, don't try and save an approach. But watching for these sudden changes in direction and velocity that you can see on the wind vector on the nav display is really important. So be prepared to go around if any of these conditions change at a rate that you are being dealt with. And remember, the closer you get to the ground, the more important it is to be cocked and ready to go around. That is extremely important. You don't want to be fooling around with this. The systems work, as I'll mention in the upcoming slide here, close to the ground. And you know, this is where you really have to be very careful about what may happen that last few hundred feet. And I'm a big advocate. If you see these things changing, don't wait for a wind shear warning on the approach path. Get out of there. If you think that you need it, get out of there by disconnecting the autopilot, disconnecting the auto throttles, go to emergency or max power with the throttles, and get out of there. And we'll talk a little bit about that escape maneuver here in the upcoming slides. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the warning system operation itself. It's designed to function on approaches and takeoff. Now, we're going to talk about approaches here. We're not talking about takeoff. I'll cover that in some later modules. Now, here's the way the system works, at least on the 737. Unless there are some carriers that have a different system, this is the one that's pretty standard on most domestic 737 air carriers. The system operates based on the weather radar and the radio altimeter. So the way this system starts to get ready to assist you in wind shear conditions is when you get to 2,500 feet radio altimeter, that's when it starts to operate. Well, I use the term it wakes up. It's just kind of like the alarm goes off and says, all right, get ready. And then at 18 to 1,200 feet, it's kind of a little bit more attentive to what it is going to have to do in the last 1,200 feet to 50 feet. This is when warnings are alive and active if they're activated, if it's activated. So you need to understand it's this 1,200 feet and lower that the actual warning systems work. Now, with this here, I want you to understand how close you are to the ground before these warnings become alive. And you know, as I mentioned to you in a previous slide, I mean, you can lose a lot of altitude very quickly before you almost have a chance to react. And that is why be on your toes here, be ready to go around at any point and activate that wind shear guidance system. Now, the nav display also has some symbology, and I would suggest that you really review your manuals on that. There's a cone that it looks for. It gives you monitor radar display. Some of those displays come up prior to any kind of verbalization, but there is a caution portion of it and a warning portion of it. In the caution portion, you may get some symbology that will come up and give you a little bit of a forewarning of what the system is seeing. Now, here's an important point. Gang, well, that little chirp there was my foot, okay? This is most important. If you go around prior to the warning of saying, go around, Windshear ahead, what you're obviously going to do is disconnect the auto throttles. You're going to disconnect the autopilot, and you're going to apply max power and hit toga. Now, that I'm hitting toga is important. Now, here's one thing you will not find. I've never been able to find a good, clear answer on this, so I'm going to advocate that what you do is you take the real cautious approach. If you decide to go around prior to the warning and you hit toga, you get toga guidance, not Windshear avoidance guide, not Windshear avoidance guidance, but Windshear guidance. So here's the important point about if you decide to go around prior to getting a Windshear warning, hit toga, use emergency power, full power, disconnect the autopilot, auto throttle, and when you get the warning, hit toga again. So when you get the warning, or when you decide to go around prior to the warning, disconnect the autopilot, disconnect the auto throttle, apply full power, and hit toga in that process. Make sure you hit toga. Pilot monitoring, make sure that toga is executed. But keep in mind, prior to the warning, you've got toga direction, not escape guidance. So be aware of that. And once you get the warning, hit toga again, because the system gives you guidance for a escape maneuver and its parameters after it gives you a warning. So recognize that you need to hit toga a second time to get Windshear escape guidance. And there are parameters that are involved in that Windshear guidance. It's always hard to find some of that information because I think legally they kind of want to be a little guarded about it. But I can tell you that initially, the best I remember from the system is that when you hit toga after that warning, it's going to give you a 15-degree pitch guidance to give you an initial effort to give you a climb gradient. If 15 degrees does not give you a climb gradient and you start to lose altitude and you get within the parameter of less than 600 feet per minute climb, the guidance is going to take you to the stick shaker. So that's a second part of it. And what it's going to do is give you indications on the pitch bar in and out of stick shaker. And hopefully at that point you'll get some climb out of it somewhere before you start to get to a real stall. So be aware, gang, that in this go around prior to a Windshear warning, hit that toga switch again. You can't hit it enough after you get a warning, in my opinion. Now, if you have go around after the warning, then the guidance is what you're going to get as I just explained here. It's going to give you a 15-degree pitch to get you out of the Windshear condition, And again, it's going to operate where if you have a rate of climb that's less than 600 feet per minute, it's going to go to stick shaker. Now, that's the last information I remember on the systems that I was familiar with. I'm not going to bet the ranch on that. It's best that I remember. I can't find any information currently that gives that description. And I know there's always been some talk about kind of being guarded about that information, and it's probably one of the legalese that goes on in airlines, okay? So in any case, just be aware of that. I want to end it with this. Be prudent about challenging wind shear conditions. Make some decisions continually from the time you learn about it to the time you start an approach, and once you start an approach, be more geared toward escaping than continuing. But if you can continue, do so. If you continue to do that safely, do so. But be prepared to execute an escape. These wind shear conditions are not anything to fool around with and to be trustful of that you're definitely going to make it. Now, the thing that I want to cover here too, that is the last part that is helpful with tools. We've mentioned this before on crosswind landings, but on your nav display, and this is where I would suggest the pilot monitoring be very much involved in this. Constantly monitor this wind vector. And when you start to see direction change quickly, when you start to see velocity change quickly, be on guard. Communicate that to your partner who's flying. Communicate the direction and the velocity. Give a relatively rapid response to that. I'd say, for instance, maybe every 5-7 seconds, be giving the direction and velocity, because in a wind shear condition, that is going to change. Both of those are going to change in a wind shear condition. Now, the other thing is come up on the progress page 2, and as we mentioned before, 2 for crosswinds here, you have this information that is available to you. And so this is another good source to be monitoring, and the pilot that is monitoring the flight really look into this information here. Plus you have this cross-track error here too, which is important, because many times if you're dealing with a wind shear condition and also some pretty good crosswinds, this is going to call for the best you got. So gang, this is it for this portion here. I hope it is helpful. Thing that I know that you're going to get some of this kind of training in your training. You probably get some of it in recurrent now, because this is a condition that history has proved is really important to have some familiarity with. But the big thing is to recognize that maybe the best thing for me to do, know my limits. Don't be one of these individuals that looks to challenge what you feel comfortable with. If you're not comfortable with doing anything in an aircraft under these unusual conditions that you can sometimes encounter as an airline pilot, be cautious about it. Maybe 5 years later, you'll be able to handle it better than you can currently. So be prudent, gang. Okay? This is a big area to be really humble about, be confident about, but also in that, be prudent. All right, everybody. Hey, wishing you good flying.